Hi, my name is Sarah Farkas. I am the Student Support Specialist at the Educational Resource Center. And I've given this workshop about 12 times so far since September for different demographics. It started out being requested a lot by Writing 97, 98 instructors. So I've delivered the workshop a lot to undergraduate international students. I delivered it during Met International's orientation, so it was about 150 international students. But I've also gone to Sargent. I delivered it to 2 groups of domestic graduate students on Friday. So I had a question that came in with the RSVPs asking how to tailor it, how I tailor the workshop to international students. And I think an answer to that is that the workshop works for any kind of student. It also works for staff. What the difference is when I give the workshop is that the way that they respond to the content is different, so the questions will be different. I think you'll see as I go through it, the places that I have to stop and explain more are different depending on the population. If I'm talking to graduate students, there are some things that are sometimes understood. Like when I'm talking to you today, there are gonna be some things I'm gonna ask you to participate, you're gonna know the answer. So what I'm gonna ask you to do is to kind of put on your student hat for today. I'm gonna give this workshop to just like I give it to students when I go to see them, because I think part of the exercise that will be helpful is to understand what students are really facing when they're facing the question of how to avoid plagiarizing. Because what this workshop deals with most is not, don't go buy a paper on the internet or stop cutting and pasting things from Wikipedia, right? It deals much more with plagiarizing unintentionally. Before I worked before I came on at the ERC, I was a graduate student here for 7 years. I got my PhD in philosophy, and then I taught philosophy here. I taught it at Emerson and at Emmanuel and at Suffolk. So I got to see plagiarism all over Boston, in different places, exotic locales. But what I saw the most, the cases that I remember the most were the horribly egregious cases where somebody copied an entire legal dictionary and handed it to me. But what I saw the most of, though, was unintentional plagiarism. People not understanding what plagiarism was, or completely paraphrasing incorrectly. So I think that's hopefully what you'll get out of this today. And I'll ask you some of the questions I'm gonna ask you, you're definitely gonna know the answers to. Again, I'll appreciate your participation. But so to start, I just wanna ask, if anyone can volunteer, what is plagiarism? Anybody? Sure, yeah.
Taking someone else's work that's not yours.
Exactly. So taking somebody else's work that's not yours and then claiming it as your own. When I give this to students, they usually get that first part, but don't get the second part, right? Claiming it as your own. So you take someone else's work, you don't document it, then you hand it in to the professor for a grade. I have the official definition here. And what I like about this definition is at the end it talks about it being the result of someone else's time and effort. And I think that it's something that I don't think students think a lot about when they take something off the internet, say. When I used to try to explain to students why plagiarism was wrong, my first tack as a kind of young teacher was to say, it's not fair, what you're doing isn't fair, now you have an unfair advantage. And they were just kind of like, well, I don't care, I got this advantage. That didn't work. But what was helpful was to say, imagine this, imagine that you spent so much time working on a piece of music or a piece of art or a YouTube video, right, or whatever it is that's gonna appeal to you, and you put it up on the internet. And then as soon as you put it up, somebody else took it, put it on their site, and it got 1 million hits. How would that make you feel? And I think the answer to that is completely awful, right? Somebody just took something that you cared a lot about and slapped their name on it. And I think if you can start thinking about it in that way, it's a lot easier to understand why it's wrong, other than it being just wrong according to our academic conduct code, right? They can't do it. But somebody else really cared about this. Even if you're doing it on Wikipedia, somebody wrote that entry, and now you're taking it, and it's not yours. So fun fact, the word plagiarism actually comes from the Latin word plagiaris, That means kidnapping. That sounds even worse than plagiarism. It sounds really criminal, right? And according to the conduct code, you cannot do it. Yet students still do it. So I guess my next question is, why do you think students do this when they know that they can't do it? Yeah?
Poor time management?
Yeah, so poor time management, I think that's a great, one of the number one reasons that people end up in the plagiarism boat, right? They're pushed against the wall. Yeah?
Having a poor foundation in writing or not understanding sort of the concept of unintentional plagiarism.
Right, so having a poor foundation in writing and not understanding the concept of unintentional plagiarism, I think that falls into both too, because if you have a poor foundation in writing, some students will say, I can't do this, I don't understand, so I'm just gonna choose to take something intentionally, or then unintentionally you might not paraphrase correctly. Yeah?
Misunderstanding citation.
Yeah, so just misunderstanding citation, not knowing how to document correctly, not having gotten that far in the process. Yeah?
Fear of not meeting the professor's expectations using their own work.
Right. Fear of not meeting the professor's expectations using their own work. Fear of failure, right? Students put a lot of pressure on themselves, and I think, yeah, that's one of the reasons that they find themselves plagiarizing. Yeah?
For international students wanting it to sound native.
Oh, that's great. I haven't heard that one. For international students, wanting the paper to sound native, right, is another reason. Yeah?
I think sometimes when students don't have a firm grasp of the concept, they'll plagiarize because they're like, oh, that's what I'm trying to get at, instead of being their own words.
So yeah, lack of understanding. If they don't grasp the concept really concretely, sometimes it's easier to just kind of put it in there because they can't do it in their own words. And I actually saw students, I had a plagiarism case once, an international student was doing that as a bookmarking technique. They were putting in other people's words and they were gonna figure it out in their own words later, and they passed the paper in that way. So that's a strategy that some students use, I wouldn't recommend. Yeah?
I've heard from some international students that plagiarizing, when they plagiarize, it's a way of honoring the person who actually wrote the words.
That's fantastic. So one thing that's being brought up here is international students, when they plagiarize, they feel that it's a way of honoring the author's words. That is another one that I haven't heard yet, and that's fantastic, right? Yeah?
Not understanding the relationship between writing and learning.
Not understanding the relationship between writing and learning.
The point of the exercise is to learn something, and plagiarizing is missing the point of the exercise.
Right, so the point of the exercise is to learn something, and plagiarism is missing the point of the exercise. And we'll actually get into that too a little bit, because I do think that that's a big problem, just in general, that students sometimes aren't thinking about. I'm going to talk about self-plagiarism a little bit. Can you?
I'd say it's the most important thing, actually, since what we're trying to do is teach them something. The legal strictures are a little bit besides the point that our project is to teach.
Right, so if our project is teaching, students need to be concerned with learning, and if that's not at the forefront, they get really focused on the writing and whatever they're going to get for their grade, and they find themselves plagiarizing. So these are some of the causes that I've cataloged here. I think all of them have come up. Unintentionally, just to point out, sloppy notes. I'll talk more about that later. But sloppy notes, when I think about sloppy notes, is if you're doing research for a project and you've put your own commentary down in your notes, and you've also written down a bunch of things that authors have said, and you haven't delineated between the two, and then you go back to write your paper, and you have no idea what your original thoughts are and what you wrote down. So that happens. Ignorance of the rules was brought up. In some cultures, there just is not a word for plagiarism, right? So students entering the United States classroom for the first time need to learn how to navigate this. Improper paraphrasing or summary skills, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about this. And just carelessness, not documenting, not knowing how to document, things like that. And again, we have the two types of plagiarism. We know what the intentional types of plagiarism are. If you copy a friend's work, buy or borrow a paper. A very popular form of plagiarism now, because it's so easy with the internet, cutting and pasting blocks of text from e-sources without documenting. It's so easy, so simple. Spark Notes and Cliff Notes, taking those ideas, which professors, I think, would prefer you not to be using Spark Notes and Cliff Notes in the first place, so they don't, and I always say to students, you can cite Spark Notes and Cliff Notes, they don't want to do that, because then it will reveal that they have not been using the original book that they were supposed to be using. So they'll use Spark Notes and Cliff Notes and then not put a citation there. Taking ideas from a journal article, from someone's blog, a classmate, even if you change the words, you're still plagiarizing. And then over here we have careless paraphrasing, poor documentation, quoting excessively. Now, why would quoting excessively be plagiarism if you're using the correct citations? Yeah?
You're not synthesizing the information.
You're not,
Representing.
yeah, you're not synthesizing the information, and you're not using your own voice, right, which comes next on this list. You're just representing the information. So if students use quotes too many times, there comes a certain point that you pass where you're just not handing in original work anymore. And that's very intricately connected to failure to use your own voice, right? Every student has a distinctive voice that you should kind of hear in your mind when you're reading a paper. If you've read enough of a student's paper, you can really start to hear that voice. If they're using excessive quotation, that won't come through, right? Because you're going to hear the author's voice. So do I have to cite everything? No. You don't have to cite everything, right? There are some things that you don't have to cite. You don't have to cite facts that are widely known, and you don't have to cite information or judgments that are considered common knowledge. You'll see what we consider common knowledge can be kind of tricky, but these are things that you don't have to cite. So what's common knowledge? Common knowledge is information that can be easily observed. So if you want to start your paper with something like "the sky is blue," I wouldn't recommend that as an introductory topic sentence, but you could use that because your professor can easily go outside and observe that the sky is blue. Your professor probably also already knows that, but even if the professor doesn't know it, they can go observe that information. But here's a crucial difference. If you want to start the paper out with a really detailed scientific explanation of why the sky is blue, that's not common knowledge, right? Because your professor, just from looking at the sky, can't glean that information. So that's a crucial difference. And the same goes with commonly reported facts. If you grew up in a United States classroom, you know that George Washington was the first president of the United States. So no need to cite that. But if you want to start throwing in really minor details about George Washington's life that you probably got from a historian somewhere, that's not common knowledge, right? So there's this distinction between kind of very surface level knowledge that we can observe or that we've all kind of known and knowledge that you would have to get from an authority. And then also common sayings, which again, I'd leave waste not, want not out of the paper entirely, but if you want to, you can put it in. You can put in look before you leap. You can't track who came up with these proverbs, right? And that's why you don't have to cite them. But you should be careful when dealing with common knowledge because lots of what we consider common knowledge are actually just myths. So when I grew up, I heard all the time that if you were living in the Middle Ages, you were going to die super early, right? Like 20 years old. That's actually not true. So if you put it in your paper, you're not going to be docked for plagiarism, but you're just going to be plain wrong, right? So watch out when you're dealing with common knowledge. You want to make sure that the facts that you're putting in your paper are correct. And some things that get disseminated are just myth. Common knowledge is discipline specific. And this goes back to the point that I was making about the detailed explanation about the sky being blue. If you were in an advanced science class and wanted to write that detailed explanation, that would probably be fine. But if you were in an advanced philosophy class and wanted to kind of bring that in to your philosophy paper, that would probably not be fine. Because that is not the background knowledge that most philosophers are operating with. And the same would be true in the reverse. If you were back in that advanced science course, but you really wanted to include this information about Immanuel Kant, who was this famous moral philosopher, that is not discipline specific. Scientists don't have that information. So part of knowing what common knowledge is also knowing your audience when you're writing a paper. And sometimes I get pushback from students because some student will be like, what if I just love, a couple of students have been really into science and known all sorts of scientific facts. And the tip that I give them is just to cite it. Find it, cite it. Because you don't want to leave a red flag in there for your professor, especially if you're bringing this kind of advanced level explanation out that you haven't learned in class, that's above the kind of class that you're taking. Just cite, just give a citation. So at least the professor might not know the information. So not only do you not have to worry about plagiarism then, but your professor can then go and find the facts for themselves. I think a good rule of thumb is that if it's new information to you, you can't really know whether it's common knowledge or not. It's hard to navigate a new field. That idea is to kind of be like, well, I just learned this, but I'm just going to assume everybody else knows it. Wrong way to do it, right? So when in doubt, just cite. So now we can do a little quiz. Last semester, you wrote an essay on Emily Dickinson in American Literature 101. This semester, you're taking a course called Interrogating Gender in American Culture. Your new professor has assigned a paper topic that references Dickinson's life and work. It would be very easy for you to use whole sections of your first essay to satisfy the requirements of the second. You decide you don't need to ask your professors for permission since the papers are your own work. Would this be plagiarism, yes or no? Yes, it would be plagiarism. But tell me why, though, because it's my own work. I wrote it. Yeah?
So if you've already used it in a class, you've already read it per se for that word, so using it again, it sort of gets to that question, but you've not learned anything new.
Yeah.
You're just reusing old word.
It certainly flies in the face of what the purpose of the assignment is. But it's still original work, though, isn't it?
It's the sort of you got credit for it.
Right. Right.
It's as if it's been published.
Right. Did you want to say something?
Well, sort of what you've already said, except I think it's worth making a distinction between the credit argument and the you're not learning anything argument.
Yeah, those are two different arguments. So,
I think
yeah.
it's worth making a distinction between the credit argument, which is a sort of just a rule-based argument, and you're not learning anything this way, which is a why are we doing this in the first place kind of argument.
So there's a distinction to be made between, and they're both fair points. There's a distinction to be made between saying you already got credit for this assignment, and you're not learning anything from this assignment. Those are two different points, but they're both valid points. When a professor designs, yeah, Glenn Wrigley.
And I think, but you may correct me, but I think it is in VU's
I know it is.
conduct
Yeah.
code
Mhm.
that you cannot submit an assignment that you've already completed and handed in one class to another class and receive credit for it.
Right, so Glenn is right, it is in the conduct code. It's called self-plagiarism. So what you can do, so I think the reason why it's called self-plagiarism, yes, you're not learning anything new. And when a professor designs an assignment for you, they want you to learn something new. And in learning something, the way that you achieve that goal is to create something original for the assignment. Yes, your work is original. That work you did for the first professor was yours, but it's not original anymore for the new assignment, right? You haven't created something original for the new assignment. Yeah?
Well, in the conduct code, it does say if you have.
Yes, and I always make that really clear. So yeah, you were pointing out, in the conduct code, it does say if you have permission, you can do it. And I always want to make that clear because it could be the case that one day it happens that you've written this perfect paper and you get an assignment that's extremely similar. And we don't want students to have to kind of regurgitate the exact same thing. So if you can go to the first professor, get permission, go to the second professor, get permission, then it's fine. But you do have to have the permission. And some professors will be really transparent about it. I had a professor once who gave us a bunch of mini assignments. And every time he gave the assignment, he would say, this is going to be great for your final paper. You're just going to incorporate this right in your final paper. So I knew the whole time that if I used one of my smaller papers in my final paper, it would not be plagiarism. But that can't be assumed. Did you want to say something? Yeah.
I was just going to say that one of the times that I saw that happening a lot was if you have an assignment from annotated bibliography, so you've done basically all of the research for the paper but not been written the paper.
Right.
That is a perfect example of when to then get permission and do new learning and actually work with resources in a way you don't with bibliography itself.
Right. So the case being brought up here is if you've had to do an annotated bibliography. And this kind of represents a perfect case where you've written the bibliography, but you haven't written the paper itself, right? So you need to go back and do the work. Yeah?
We had a case whereby a student in two concurrent courses handed in the same paper
Uh-huh.
with a few adaptations, but didn't tell either professor.
Yeah.
They were found guilty.
That seems right to me. Yeah, so a student who's in two courses going on at the same time hands in the same paper. That's also going to be self-plagiarism. I think absolutely, because, I mean, this example just happens to say last semester you did it, this semester you do it. You could do it at the same time. I think that's, and the same rules apply, right? You can't be handing in the same assignment for multiple courses without being open in terms of communication with the professors. So yes, this is plagiarism. We're just gonna shout it out. Which of the following are plagiarism? Copying words from a book without citing your source. Yes. Copying words from the internet without citing the website. Yes. Using uncited music or images from the internet in a paper. Yes. Republishing words, music, or images from the internet on your own website without permission. Yes. Yeah, copying words from a movie, television show, podcast, or the radio without citing the source. Yes, it still is. Using words from a professor's lecture without citing your professor. Yes, and don't do this one because the professor will know. So I think, but yeah, all of these are definitely plagiarism. And the one that I think people hesitate about the most is copying words from a movie, television, podcast, or the radio. That's all copyrighted material. So it still holds. So,
Fair use? What about fair use?
well, so I'm not a lawyer.
If we're approaching from the intellectual property angle, then you can start making fair use arguments.
Fair use arguments come in when you're using, I have no legal training. But
I think we're shuttling between a way of thinking which is legalistic and a way of thinking which is educational.
I mean, I would make the argument that we have to straddle both lines because we give these rules to students in a conduct code.
Yeah.
We cannot get away from the legalism. But I think the purpose that's always behind giving this workshop is educational. We don't want them to be plagiarizing because we want them to be learning, right? That's my goal. Yes, I don't want them to have to go before an academic conduct committee either. I don't want the people in the committee to have to be there. I don't want the professor to have to be there. I don't want them to have to be there. But they need to be learning. Yeah?
Copyright isn't actually relevant in this case because if someone had published something on the internet with a Creative Commons license.
Yeah, I just meant copyright by when you.
You still need to cite it. They're not your own ideas.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a publicly available document that is out of the public domain. You still need to cite it. They're not your own ideas.
Yeah, and when I use the term copyright, I'm using it very loosely.
I think just that point 4 is a little bit out of, it doesn't match the same logic as the other things. Well, point 4 is a copyright issue, all the other points are plagiarism issue.
No, point 4 is the plagiarism issue. Yeah.
In my understanding, fair use has more to do with taking something.
It does.
A video or something and showing it in a lecture. That's fair use. Taking the words out of that video and putting it into a written document.
Yes.
That's the question. Am I presenting those words as my own, or am I citing them properly? So I think, defining what fair use is. Anyone at BU, fair use is if this PowerPoint presentation is online, you can show it. You can show it. It's labeled as ERC writing assistance, and so everyone knows that it's ours. Y'all can use it. I think that has.
That is what, yeah, fair use, in how I've heard it, when Dennis Hart came and talked to us, how I've heard it is, taking chunks of video and showing them. What I'm talking about here is quoting a movie in your paper, taking lines from a movie in a paper, summarizing a whole movie. You have to cite the movie. That's somebody else's material just in the same way as a book or anything else is. I think it's just the point that I was trying to make.
I have to agree, though, that point 4 is really more of a copyright issue because the permission aspect is about copyright, not about, fair use basically says you don't need to have someone's permission to represent their work in the educational setting. And
Right.
it does apply to students, not just to teaching. It's also their ability to quote from articles and books and, the internet and other sources. And that point 4 on the last slide really is very much about the idea of permission gets back to copyright and what you can do with copyright. And fair use is an exception to copyright.
Right.
An exception
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I usually present it that way. I usually say it's copyrighted material. But, I mean, the point that we're trying to make is that I use a textbook. I used a textbook in the past, and the person that wrote the textbook loved to quote movies and songs. I mean, you just have to put the documentation in there, just like you would a book, and that's the overall point.
So it's about footnoting rather than permission.
Yeah, it's not a permission. I mean, what I'm trying to say is not, if you want to quote from Titanic in your paper, you don't have to call up the people that made Titanic, right? You just need to, the professor needs to find their way back to your source. But yeah, you're right, and that copyright operates in that example in a way that it doesn't in the other examples, but there's no permission issues in terms of using it in papers, stuff like that.
How specific is our code on using some material from one paper that a student writes and putting it into another?
Yeah.
Not a whole.
I don't think it's super clear. So you can't reuse a whole paper. And I don't know exactly, maybe someone here in the room does know the exact line that's drawn where you've now used too much of a paper. Are you using a paragraph? I mean, I think that you probably shouldn't be reusing any of the paper. Or if you are reusing part of the paper, I think the best thing to do would be to talk to the professor about it. If you want, let's say it's 2 paragraphs. You could say, I wrote about Emily Dickinson last semester. It was a 2-paragraph introduction. I don't know how to write it in a better way. Can you help me? If you can't help me, can I use it?
You know, as somebody who grew up in a different era, I just wonder sometimes whether we push some of these concepts a little too far.
Right.
If you look at scientists who were publishing in the 60s and 70s, who were writing frequently on the same topic,
Right.
look at their introductions from journal article to journal article, you would see self-plagiarism all over.
They're really similar. Yeah.
And even though the material was copyrighted and you might be going from one publisher to another, nobody gave a second thought to it. It was not the bulk of the paper, but was important information which you hopefully had written extremely well the first time, that you might add new information to, but was largely the same, if not exactly the same. Guilty as charged.
Would you cite yourself?
Well, of course.
So yeah, so that's the students can't cite themselves, and I think that that's the big because yeah, I think that still happens in academia all the time now. Scholars incorporate large chunks of papers, and that's totally fine because they can cite themselves, and then I can find your paper.
Yes.
But I can't, when Jimmy gives me his paper and I'm reading it, and he cited his unpublished manuscript. I don't know what this is, and I can't go back and read it. So I do think that's the difference.
Yeah, I just wonder sometimes
Yeah.
if we're pushing these limits
If we're pushing it too far.
in a way that takes it to an extreme that's unreasonable.
I think that's fair, and I think that's something that we can think about too. Whether we're pushing these concepts to an extreme that makes it unreasonable, and I think that's certainly something to think about. My hope with this workshop is that questions like this would come up. Yeah, absolutely. So my next, yeah, sure, Linda.
To follow from what Glenn said, I wonder also about the matter of the progress a student makes over an academic career. At
Right.
what point does the student understand, has integrated, has learned, and therefore those ideas are that person's own? And I'm talking as much analysis as anything else.
Right.
So if a upper division English major is alluding to his understanding of the Odyssey that he developed through
That-
the core curriculum
yes.
and all those things.
That might be background knowledge at that point.
Yes.
Right.
So because, I often would say to my own students, I did not, I'm a transliterary critic. I cannot say to you that every idea I have about Othello and Hamlet is original to me. I mean, I'm kind of a ragbag of details too.
Right.
So I know maybe it's a little more a challenging issue, and we were dealing with it more as upper division students
Right.
of this matter of not the gross kinds of issues around plagiarism. I just wanted to raise that.
And I think it's a really fair point. At a certain point, as you advance in a field, almost everything is going to become common knowledge, right? And so I think it's fair at that point that you probably don't have to worry about things like that anymore. And sometimes I'll have students, particularly international students, come up to me after a session and say, what if I have an idea? How do I know that somebody else hasn't had it already? And that is something that we just can't, like if you, all you can do is your best, right? All you can do is work with integrity. You can't think, oh my God, what if I somehow pick this up, through osmosis by someone else who's speaking on the street? Like then it's just become, you're not going to be able to get anything done. But I think that's a really good point because students do get scared and they do bring it up. And how do I even know my ideas are my own? And now we're getting into this meta-philosophical debate. So I think the advice that I always give is the only thing that you can do is your best. If you do feel like this is your idea and you do not consciously know that you have picked it up from somebody else, that's the best that you can do in this situation. And otherwise, if you know who you should be citing from, cite it, right? But thank you for that, because I think that's really important. Taking words or ideas from most websites is plagiarism, but Wikipedia is an exception, because information on Wikipedia is common knowledge. So false. What?
We wouldn't need Wikipedia.
Yeah, so if it were, we wouldn't need Wikipedia. So this is just grossly false, because no one goes on Wikipedia to find out stuff that they already know, right? So it's not common knowledge. But sometimes common knowledge gets conflated with common access, right? Well, everyone can go on Wikipedia, we all know it. No, I don't know everything on Wikipedia. I can get to everything on Wikipedia. That's a difference. And Wikipedia is problematic as a source of ideas and as a source of facts beyond that, too. Wikipedia is an encyclopedia, right? We all remember encyclopedias. Some of us do, right? I do. They used to be books. And what they are, it's a bunch of ideas. It's a bunch of research that's brought together that somebody else has done, right? So you pick up the encyclopedia and you can find out all sorts of stuff. But what we want our students to be doing is original research. So going to Wikipedia as a source of ideas is problematic because the research is already done for you. What you can do if you find something that you want to work with on Wikipedia, those little blue links on the bottom refer back to the original articles. Then you can go do your original research. But as college students, you need to be using the original thoughts, right? So if you find something on Wikipedia you want to use, go to the reference at the bottom, click on it, go to that article. What's the other problem with Wikipedia, though? Yeah.
Commonly incorrect.
It's commonly incorrect. It's commonly incorrect because everybody has access. There are people who are professional Wikipedia trolls, right, who just go and change Wikipedia entries to make them hilarious or wrong, or fix them. People like to fix them too. But the problem is that it's not a verifiable source for facts. So, and if you're putting a fact in your paper, you should be able to check it by 2 other sources. So Wikipedia probably shouldn't be one of those sources. Yeah?
So whose responsibility is it for the students to understand what an original, whose responsibility is it for a student to understand what's an original piece of information, or what's a scholarly work? What's second and third level versus original?
Whose responsibility is it? I don't know. I mean, I think it has to happen. It has to be taught to them by the professors along the way, right? That's how I learned it. It wasn't a lesson that I don't think I really caught on to it until I was about a junior or senior in college, because that's when you're starting to have to do work that's a little bit more sophisticated and original. I certainly figured it out by the time I got to my PhD program, right? But oftentimes, the hard way. But yeah, I don't know if I ever had a faculty member explicitly say, this is how you conduct original scholarly research. So that's perhaps a conversation that needs to be happening more. Yeah.
The fine folks at the library would be happy.
Yes, the fine folks at the library, and I tell students that all the time. There are people employed at the library who will teach you all about how to do original research. Don't start at Wikipedia, please. Like, you can use those links at the bottom if you want to, but don't have that be your first stop on learning how to do a research paper. Yeah, the library is a great research. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not going to use Wikipedia, but I'm still going to use Google.
Again, you can use Google, but you need to make sure that whatever you get to, you're going all the way back until there's a point where you end, right? And the end point should be the original author. Does that make sense?
Of course it makes sense, but I'm not sure we're teaching it as well as we should be.
I think that could be, I think that's a fair point. Yeah?
Two things that I went. One, this confusion seems to be good evidence for the danger of making arguments about plagiarism using arguments about intellectual rights, because it's clear that the student can't tell the difference between something that's open access, therefore it's okay, and something that wasn't my idea, and therefore it's not okay. The other thing is that writing a college paper, beginning to work in this genre, is a really complicated language game with a lot of rules, most of which are implicit. We feel that they're clear, but freshmen, students generally coming in,
Well, they're
know
not
that
clear.
there's a game with a lot of rules. They don't know what the rules are. They just know that they can break them at any time. So it's a real service to make as many rules as possible clear about what we're doing, why we're doing it. And that's not the same as referring to a rule book. That, I think, is best served by explaining why the rules are what they are, why they're there, from the point of view of what our project is, which is learning.
Sure. I think that's a fair point. Okay, so you're writing a report for organic chemistry, and you have included information that you read in your textbook. You aren't sure if this information can be considered common knowledge or whether you need to cite it. Eventually, you decide you're just going to cite the textbook when quoting exact words and phrases, but not when you're just summarizing ideas from the text, because this information is common knowledge for your class. Would this be plagiarism? Yes, no? Now we don't know. So, does anybody want to give it a shot? Yeah.
I would say you can't make the argument that it's common knowledge because you're taking the class.
Yes. So, and you'll notice at the beginning of this, it started with you aren't sure if the information is common knowledge. And I said before, if you aren't sure, if you're just learning it, just cite it, right? When in doubt, cite. So the safest thing to do in this situation would be to cite the information because you're already unclear. And I think whenever that question pops into your head, is this common knowledge? You've gone too far. No, cite it. Don't then try to say, I hope so, and pass in your paper. So the way that we enter this is maybe, maybe not. Because if you get lucky and it is common knowledge, then it is not plagiarism. But exactly like you said, you just learned it from the textbook. So it's not common knowledge to you. Excellent rule of thumb, if you're learning something new, just cite it. And I don't think, yeah.
Say that with my students, I tend to encourage them to not cite the textbook really at all, in the sense that oftentimes it isn't the person who wrote the textbook that came up with the idea that they are putting
Right.
forward. And so usually textbooks will cite, if they're a good textbook, they'll cite who they got that from, and I encourage my students to follow that path back.
Sure.
Because
so
sometimes
the
textbooks
correct,
can be wrong.
So that's excellent that you're doing that too. Yeah. So just finding the correct citation for the information, yeah, would be the best way forward in that situation. But not just kind of saying like, well, I'm going to take a gamble, I think is a bad idea. Okay. So while researching a paper, you find yourself patching together ideas from different sources. You lose track of which ideas were your own and which were from articles and websites. You aren't sure whether you've actually miscited anything or not. You don't know. It would be very difficult to go back and check all the original sources, and you also waited till the very last second. So you figure that if your professor asks about your sources, you can say that you did not intentionally plagiarize. I didn't do it on purpose. Would this result in a lesser punishment? No, and you all know this, right? It would not. We write here that it is institution dependent, but at the institution that you are at, it will not result in a lesser punishment. Faculty members are encouraged to report all cases of academic misconduct. You don't want to go through this process. It's not a pleasant process for anyone involved. Not you, not the people who are on the committee, not the faculty member. It's not worth the risk. But there's another option that if you were a student that you could pursue here. What might be a better option? Yeah.
Making good notes to
Yeah, so if you could get it back in the time machine, and you could just make better notes. Yeah, so this is a sloppy notes example. So that's exactly right. You could have done it right to begin with. Yeah.
Ask for an extension.
Yeah, so ask for an extension. 100%. I think as a faculty member, I didn't get very many emails that said, hi, I'm concerned about my academic integrity and I'd like a day to check my sources. But I got lots of plagiarism though. So I think a faculty member would be happy to see this kind of email. It doesn't mean that you're not going to get docked the late penalty, because you might. But whatever that late penalty is not going to compare to the process of going in front of an academic misconduct committee, right? So open communication with the professor in these cases, I think, is always the best idea. Okay, so now we're going to get into paraphrasing. So you're helping your friend edit her paper, and she's wondering if her paraphrase is okay. So the original quotation is from Betsy Van Light, and it reads as follows. The youth of today encounter innumerable social challenges and may get caught up in a variety of risky behaviors that have immediate or delayed negative consequences. Here's your friend's best shot. According to Van Light, modern adolescents run into many social challenges and thus might end up taking part in risk-taking behaviors that could have terrible costs sooner or later. Has your friend committed plagiarism? I see, okay, if yes, all right, how many people think absolutely yes? How many people think no? Great, so if you think no, why do you think no?
It's attributed.
It is attributed. It sure is, it is attributed, so they've gotten that part right. Because when you're paraphrasing, you have to use the citation. So it's totally attributed. Those that think it is plagiarism, what's the problem? Glenn?
It's a word-for-word translation.
Yes, so this is what we call a translated paraphrase. It is plagiarism. And when I first was trained on this workshop, the color drained out of my face, and I thought to myself, I have committed plagiarism before. And I think this is a common reaction to this example. The problem here is that the voice hasn't changed at all, right? So when you paraphrase, it has to be entirely new phrasing, entirely new words, entirely new sentence structure. What it needs to look and read like is that you've closed whatever book you're working with and you've written the idea down yourself because you understand it so well. Once you can get rid of that book, you're gonna form an entirely new sentence. It's not gonna sound the same as Betsy Van Light at all. But what happened here is this student had the book open and kind of translated each phrase. So youth of today becomes modern adolescence, encounter becomes run into, innumerable becomes many, social challenges gets quotes, may becomes might. Risk-taking is translated from risky behaviors, immediate or delayed becomes sooner or later. So you can see how it's just kind of like word-for-word translation, which if you don't understand what paraphrasing is, that may seem like it's a fine option. But more needs to be done with this. You're right, because the student is halfway there. The attribution is there. They did try to change the words, but it still sounds exactly like Betsy Van Light.
So what you're saying is that the student would have been better off with a direct.
Yes,
A direct quote would have been better.
Yeah, a direct quote in this situation would have been better.
So I understand what you're saying, and I understand the concept. This is an example of what I say is maybe pushing it a little bit too far in an academic setting.
I'd like to.
Glenn, would you like to?
I think what we're trying to do is present information to students that are starting at a zero baseline.
Yeah.
Okay. It was stated earlier that there are conventions to academic writing in this country. And it takes a lot of learning to fully understand those conventions and get up to the ability to write at, let's say, a PhD level. And so what we're doing is we're exposing students to the idea that we require citation in academic writing in the United States. It's going to be up to the faculty member to determine, am I going to push this or am I not? It could be a very simple conversation between a faculty member and a student. You cited this, you told me who originally wrote it. However, in the future, when you're doing something like this, you can't translate like in this way. So it's acculturating students to the idea that we cite in this country, and there may be such a thing for a freshman as over-citation, but it's going to be up to us as faculty members to make that a teaching moment and say, you don't need to cite this, you don't need to cite this, and not have it so black and white as you did this, punishment.
Yeah, and I think I take both your points. I really do, because it scares students a little bit, I think what Glenn is saying is fair. It is gonna be up to the faculty member, this is not included in the presentation that I give to students, but it is gonna be on a case-by-case basis.
So when I said it's pushing it too far,
Yeah.
I'm talking about the penalty of it.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
to have a discussion about it, I think is perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm.
But to expect a freshman, even after hearing your workshop, to fully appreciate this in the first semester in a writing course, I think is beyond the level of the developmental stage of what the student is learning. And this process is one of development. And we should, even though, let's say in CAS, things are a grade penalty, there are sometimes even stronger consequences for students who have had a grade penalty. And I truly wonder whether this should ever rise to the, early on in the
Right.
developmental stage, to the level of even a grade penalty, and whether it's clear to faculty where that fine line is. And is it clear to faculty that they can simply have this discussion and that there's faculty discretion involved in it? Because there are rules written out.
Right,
And you just told us that this is a form of plagiarism.
right.
A separate issue is whether you would consider it actionable. And if you don't, then that implies that there are cases of the crime that are actionable and cases that are not.
And in terms of enforcing so that's something that I don't know a lot about, right? What I know is how the idea should be presented, and we're presenting it to them now as a form of inception, right? So that they move forward, the idea takes root, and they can start to write better. Because the fact of the matter is, most professors are not going to sit there and be like, wait a second, was this translated word? I don't know if I wouldn't have caught it. Right? That's the thing when I think about this. Looking at, you have 50 papers, 20 papers, I don't know. I think that was translated word for word from Betsy Van Light. I might not even remember how the sentence went, right? But the point is not, this isn't like a shock fest, right? So the point isn't for me to say, this is plagiarism and you're gonna get the harshest penalty, because that's not my job and I don't know that. But it is to say, you need to, when you're writing, if you wanna take someone else's idea and put it in your own voice, you need to learn how to do that. You need to learn how to use your own voice. Close the book, yeah.
Just give the microphone back. But the other thing that's missing here is the context. So if they're paraphrasing, and whether accurately or inaccurately paraphrasing, if they're then synthesizing in their own understanding or their own thought or moving something beyond that, it really gives more credence to the idea that they are trying to take a concept, make it something that they're working with on their own, find their own voice, because the one reason you might catch this is, it's weirdly stilted and probably isn't their own voice, right?
Yes.
Find their own voice and think about it and put something else out. And I think that transformational piece, the learning piece that has to happen, I don't think that, students necessarily understand that that's what they're supposed to do in papers.
No, I think that's entirely true. And I think that's part of why we're trying to just start the discussion about it, right? So that they can know that this is something that they should be doing. Sometimes when I ask students what voice is, it takes a long time to even get that conversation going, but we're having it, right? So yeah, I think that's really important. Okay, so if citing your sources isn't enough, because we noted that that was cited, what do you need to do instead? And then we have our strategies: quoting, paraphrasing correctly, summarizing, and you do these to blend source materials in with your own. You always want to make sure your own voice is heard. Whether you quote, whether you're paraphrasing, or whether you're summarizing, you always have to use citation. Sometimes we get stuck here. Some students, I think summaries don't need to be cited, but if you're summarizing a book, you need to cite that too. Quoting, we know what quoting is. Quoting, you're going to use the exact words, the exact capitalization, the exact punctuation. Don't randomly take words out of the quote. If you do take words out of the quote, be sure to use the brackets and the ellipsis in the brackets. And you have to cite the quotation. I feel like quotation, we talked earlier on about not to quote excessively, because if you quote excessively, that could be plagiarism. But I think quoting can get a little bit of a bad reputation. I think quoting can be an absolutely powerful tool if you use it in the correct way. So I've included here 3 ways to quote that can be really successful. So if you want to add the power of an author's words to support your argument, so you've constructed a fantastic argument, and this author happens to agree with you, that's fantastic. Put it in there to support your argument. My favorite one is the second one, because it relates to a logical fallacy called the straw man. If you want to disagree with an author's argument, but you want to avoid misrepresenting it. So when I used to teach, I used to get a lot of papers that would say things like, Kant's morality is so stupid. And then they would kind of give their own argument. What you created there, you probably are not representing Kant's thought, right, in making that argument. You're fighting against what we call a straw man. It's the logical fallacy of the straw man. You create an argument that's much weaker than the actual argument that you're arguing against, and then you win. But would you rather win an argument against a formidable opponent or someone who's really weak and stupid, as they called Kant? You'd probably want to win against the formidable opponent. So a really good way to do this is to quote your opponent, because then you don't ever have to worry, did I dumb this down? Did I not get it right? Sometimes the ideas are very complex. You can win that argument on the author's own terms, and so that's a fantastic way to quote. Also, sometimes you're just not going to be able to say it better than a particular thinker says it, so don't try. But you do want to use them sparingly. I think you want to be able to ask the question, what is this quote doing for my paper? If you don't know the answer, don't use the quote. You want to be able to, I think if the answer to the question is, well, this is a 4-page paper limit, I got 3.5, don't use the quote then either. Don't use it as a space filler. Use it to support yourself. Every quoted word needs to be cited. So if you're using a word like pretzeled that the author used, they were pretzeled between each other, that's not yours. The author used that, so quote that. And quotes have to be attributed to the original author and the source that you use. So if you're quoting someone who is dead but made a famous speech, like Abraham Lincoln, you're going to want to quote where you got it from and also quote Abraham Lincoln. But assuming that Abraham Lincoln did not speak the Gettysburg Address to you, you got to put in where you got it from as well. Paraphrasing again. So paraphrasing means rephrasing the words of an author, putting the thoughts in your own words. So you need entirely new sentence structure, entirely new words, whole new phrases. And you can do this when you want to stop using quotes or when you feel comfortable enough, when you understand enough to use your own voice. Do you know how to paraphrase correctly? As I just said, it has to be almost entirely in your own words. You have to change the sentence structure. You have to put any exact words into quotes. And also, as a rule of thumb, don't put your own commentary in the paraphrase, because then that gets confusing. Because when you paraphrase and you put a citation at the end of that, you're saying this is somebody else's. But if you put commentary in there too, that becomes a little messy. So just put it in the next sentence. So let's try this one more time. Unless steps are taken to provide a predictable and stable energy supply in the face of growing demand, the nation may be in danger of sudden power losses or even extended blackouts, thus damaging our industrial and information-based economies. Did we get it right this time? Doe warns that due to constantly growing demand, we may be in danger of losing power or even experiencing extended blackouts, which could damage our industrial and information-based economy. He recommends that the government take action to provide a predictable and stable energy supply. Did we do it? No, if we didn't do it, what's wrong with this?
We didn't even bother to translate, we just rearranged.
We just kept the words in there. This is called a reordered paraphrase. Yeah, it's true. This person didn't bother to translate. But what they did bother to do, they changed the sentence structure. The sentence structure's changed. But this is a little bit more egregious because there are whole phrases in common here, right? Provide a predictable and stable energy supply, damage our industrial and information-based economy. growing demand. These are the kinds of unintentional plagiarism cases that I used to see. Larger, the whole thing would kind of be like this. So this is something that happens, and it's a reordered paraphrase. So here I have an acceptable paraphrase. Doe believes that we must find a more reliable source of energy if we are to have a dependable electricity supply. Without these measures, the nation's economic base may be damaged by blackouts. So with this paraphrase, the words are different, the phrasing is different, the sentence structure is different, but I think most importantly, the voice is entirely different. It doesn't sound like Doe wrote this anymore. It sounds like somebody else wrote it. And I think the most important tip that I can give about being able to do this is to understand it well enough that you can close the book and get it away from you, because otherwise you will translate or reorder. That's just how the brain works. If you're looking at a sentence, you're not going to know a better way to you're going to start rearranging the sentence. If you can push it away and write down your own rephrasing of the idea, you're not going to be thinking, what order were those words in? I need to reorder them. You've forgotten the sentence structure and the words, but the idea remains. And then summarizing. Summarizing is paraphrasing's cousin, right? But you want to summarize something, you're taking a lot of information, and you're narrowing it down. So when you summarize, you'll do it a lot in introductions to papers, when you want to introduce background topic. You can do it when you've read a bunch of articles and you want to synthesize the information. And you can do it if you're asked to do a book review. You're going to synthesize the ideas of a single source. That's going to be your main strategy, is summarizing. But you must always cite when you summarize. So given all that I've said, how can you avoid plagiarizing? And I've said this over and over again. You can't safely paraphrase or summarize unless you understand it well enough to do it without looking at the textbook. If you have to, you're going to end up translating it. If you don't understand it well enough, just keep rereading it until you get it. Go to a professor. That can be really helpful in understanding ideas more, having a dialogue about it to try to understand that idea well enough so that you can write about it. If you can't get there, leave it out. Don't put it in as a quote. Because remember what I said about quotes. You always want to be able to answer the question, how is this helping my paper? And the answer shouldn't be, I'm quoting it because I don't understand it. Don't put anything that you don't understand in your paper. When taking notes, be sure to indicate clearly when you're copying words. Confusion in the notes is a top cause of unintentional plagiarism. When I used to write papers, I really loved, I would write down whole passages because I was studying something that was impossible to understand and I couldn't tell what was important or not. And it would be whole paragraphs almost, but when I would go back to write my paper, I would have it in quotes and I would have the page numbers. And so I always knew what my own thoughts were because there was a page number there and I hadn't published anything. So I knew that's not mine. And it doesn't have to be a huge, you don't need a really elaborate structure for your notes. Some people color code. Just make sure you know what's yours and what is not. And remember that you are actually responsible for knowing the conduct code. You agree to follow the conduct code when you come here. I know how you probably don't want to spend your nights looking over it, but take a look at it. You'll find things in there like self-plagiarism. But you're not alone. So the Purdue Online Writing Lab provides all sorts of information about how to cite sources. And what's great about it is that it updates as the world updates. So now you can go on there and find out how to cite a podcast. You can find out how to cite a blog, things that weren't on there 10 years ago. It also can help you switching between styles, because that can be very confusing. It can help with Chicago, APA, MLA, all the different styles that you might have to switch between. The BU Library, its website and the actual place is full of resources. Like I said before, you can go there and meet with someone who can teach you how to do a research paper. And the website is full of resources. It's full of help for creating bibliographies. It also has a lot of tutorials for tools that you can use that can help format your bibliographies as well. And don't forget to visit us at ERC Writing Assistants. You can come to our Writing Assistants program, and our writing fellows will meet with you. You can make an appointment online. And if you have a question about plagiarism, our writing fellows can help. But that's what I have to say about plagiarism. I know that we've done a lot of questions throughout, but any questions I will take. Right.
How do you recommend citing ideas that have come up in class, either in a lecture or in a more free-form seminar?
So I don't know if there's an official way to do this, but what I used to do is I would just cite my professor's name and I'd put a date. Because I don't know that a professor is then going to say, well, you didn't use MLA to cite me, right? I think if you can just put it in, acknowledge that I know that you said this and I'm using your idea. When I had a lot of angst about plagiarizing, like all throughout my academic career. I think because I had some professors that were really hardcore about it when I was a freshman or a sophomore, and so I was constantly worried about this. So yeah, I was always citing people probably when I didn't need to, but I would like put the name and the lecture date in there.
I mean, I've generally suggested that that a college paper is sort of a simulacrum of an academic paper, and so we observe the fiction that there is no class. You know,
yeah, you can do that as well. I think, and I do think it varies case by case. So I think one thing to take away from this is just having communication with professors. Any question that you might have about citing, something like, well, I don't know, you said this in class, I know it now, do I need to cite it? That's never a stupid question for a faculty member, right? So you could sort it out that way, and you could say, well, no, I don't actually feel it. Let's pretend that class doesn't exist, and now that's your common knowledge. As long as they are having that talk, I think it's great. Glenn.
And I also think that if you're teaching a course in which you've received papers where you're frequently cited, then there's an opportunity for you to establish a standard. And on your syllabus or on the first day of class, we're going to have a lot of conversations. We're going to do a lot of writing assignments. If you feel that you must cite me, then here's how to do it. I think that would just eliminate lots of, as Sarah put it, angst about how to do it correctly.
Yeah.
I think kind of the flip side of what is plagiarism that you didn't get at in the presentation and that students sometimes have a hard time grasping is why we cite, and the fact that they are, if we're pretending that it's an academic paper that's being published or, whatever sort of guise this learning is happening in, that the reason you cite is to participate in this academic conversation among peers, even if you're not yet a peer.
Right.
And I think that that's a message that takes a long time for students to absorb because it's not given to them explicitly.
I do think it would be helpful to have conversations like that too. Sometimes we get into it in the self-plagiarism part, because they'll say, well, can I cite myself? And I'll say, well, I can't get to your paper. And then we'll have a larger talk about what happens in the academic community and things like that. But it depends on the group and how much time I have and things like that. But I think that's excellent because they don't know that that's what's going on. I didn't know for years why. I just thought I had to cite it so that I wouldn't get in trouble, right? But the idea is.
It goes back to the whole idea of this not being a set of arbitrary rules, but being part of the practice of learning and of sharing information among scholars.
Right, exactly. I think that's great, yeah.
This listening is very interesting, but I think a lot of what we do as teachers is sit up there and plagiarize as we lecture. Now, I'll give you an example. You mentioned that we're not supposed to rewrite or resubmit the work we've done. You've given this 13 times. Have you plagiarized yourself?
Well, no, I don't. Well, ERC owns it, so no. But again, that's.
When I talk about a paper in class and I'm going over that paper, now, of course, we're putting it into a different context.
You're using the spoken word now.
But we do a lot of that now.
Yeah.
We do a lot of it always. So it's a funny little bit of hypocrisy, in a sense, when we're telling students not to do what we do every day.
Well, I also think when you're dealing with material that you deliver, it's different too. No, I don't really know how, it's an interesting question. But there's a difference in my going around to educate people on plagiarism and not writing a new workshop every time. That would be one of those cases where I should get permission from both professors, right? Because it would be crazy for me to write a whole new workshop every time if the assignment's exactly the same.
I don't think it's plagiarism.
No, yeah. But if the assignment's different, if the assignment's totally different, I don't know. That might be something to think about.
Well, obviously, it depends on the situation and what the students need to have explained to them,
Yeah.
the nature of the situation.
If somebody asks me to come up with something brand new that I've never done before for some sort of conference and I bring this, that's probably not right. But that's really interesting.
Well, when we give a paper at a conference, you really will never give a paper that you just published. You won't provide that guide again.
Right.
That's wrong.
Right.
And for other reasons, but it's just that it's interesting that we should be. There were a few cases here I would not have called plagiarism that you felt were. I mean, if the student decided the paper as even reworded it, I would never bring them up for academic misconduct.
Right. I mean, again, it was not something I was aware of either before I was trained on this, right? And again, I don't think the point is to necessarily warn them, trouble's coming for you when you do this. It's to get this dialogue started about what it means to paraphrase and what it means to have your own voice and how to do these things correctly so that they're not just parroting other people's voices throughout their academic careers. But yeah, no, I think I was thinking about this the other day. Like, what professor is going to even catch it? So yeah, no, I think that's totally fair.
I think it's also important to point out that the ERC, we don't have a workshop that teaches faculty how to catch students, okay, plagiarizing. What we're doing here, and I just want to reiterate a point that I made earlier, is that we're trying to get students to focus on the idea that when they're writing an academic paper, there's a standard, there's a convention that we have to follow. What one individual considers plagiarism may differ from another individual. Whether you choose to pursue it through legal channels, it's up to you as a faculty member, but we're just trying to get students used to the idea that there is this thing called paraphrasing, and that there's a way to do it properly, and there's a way to do it improperly. Fred, you might call it correct, and I might call it incorrect, and that's up to us as academics to make that call. We want to clue students into the idea that there's a standard. There's so much more gray than there is black and white. It's confusing for a lot of us. We've all been to college. We've all been to graduate school, and so it makes us think. It makes us scratch our heads. Well, no, I don't think this is, but he does. So that's where the conversation has to take place. And if there's a question or if there's something that you want to enforce in a classroom, then I think it becomes an individual faculty member's responsibility to take that upon him or herself.
And I would just want to add too, what I do like about giving this workshop is it does give opportunities to talk about helping students grow as writers, right? When we talk about, we're not just talking about quoting. Here's how you could quote to help your paper look better, to help your paper be better. Here's how to learn how to use quotes. When we talk about the paraphrasing and we show them the acceptable one, yes, it's showing them how to not get in trouble, but the overarching, the real purpose is to show them how to use their voice. So the joy that I've gotten from giving this workshop is, yeah, I like to leave the room and be like, good, hopefully none of them are gonna have to go in front of a conduct committee, but the reason it really makes me happy is I feel like they feel more confident about writing a little bit afterwards. Thanks, everybody, for your time.